In philosophy today, there are, depends on how you count, but there are maybe three or four main primary schools or theories of ethics. There's utilitarianism. Peter Singer is a utilitarian. There's Kantianism. Judith Jarvis Thompson is in many ways a Kantian. And there's what has come to be called virtue ethics. Rosalind Hursthouse is perhaps the most influential, most important proponent of virtue ethics. What we're going to do, right, and I should say, if these words and phrases, utilitarianism, Kantianism, virtue ethics, if they don't mean anything to you, if I may as well be speaking Greek, that's fine. We're going to be spending the next part of the rest of the class, more or less, not quite the rest of the class, but most of the rest of the class, figuring out what those various theories are. That's what we're going to be doing this semester. So if they don't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. What I want to do right now is look at how a virtue ethicist, such as Rosalind Hursthouse, might approach the abortion debate and what she might think of as relevant. Because what we've already begun to see is that, different people who subscribe to different philosophical views are going to say different things about abortion. Utilitarians, such as Singer, are going to emphasize the utility, you might put it, what Singer talks about, the preference satisfaction or thwarting preferences. That's what's relevant to him. When it came to Thompson, she was interested in rights and what our obligations were. Those were the main moral considerations. For the Pope, it was the natural law. Turning to Hursthouse, we get a different kind of moral consideration. She thinks that other stuff not really relevant. What's really relevant are the virtues and vices. So let's see what exactly she has to say. So one of the things that's kind of striking about her paper is that she claims that the two most common considerations brought forth in the abortion debate are irrelevant for determining the morality of abortion. They don't matter. You may as well not bring them to bear. The two most common considerations, the things she has in mind, the personhood of the fetus and women's rights. Those things, irrelevant. They don't matter if you're trying to figure out the morality of abortion. That's a pretty shocking claim. Just about everyone that we've read so far has thought personhood or women's right, that these things were central to the abortion debate, that getting clear on the status of the fetus or on the kind of strength or whatever of women's rights, that this would kind of solve the debate. This is how we figure out whether or not abortion is morally permissible. Hursthouse saying no, pack it up. Don't even bother. Those things don't matter. Well, what on earth? How does that work? Let's see what she has to say about each of those in turn, right? So start with the person of the fetus. This is the kind of trickier one to understand. Her idea is less clear here. She says the person of the fetus doesn't really matter. Why? Well, because according to Hursthouse, what really matters in the evaluation of an action and whether or not an action is morally right or morally wrong is whether or not that action expresses a virtue or a vice. The virtues and vices are what's important. And so if we want to act morally right, and if we want to do things that are only things that are permissible and so on, we don't want to do anything wrong, we need to make sure that we only ever act on virtues and never on vices. Well, why is the personhood of the fetus irrelevant to all this? Well, because according to Hursthouse, the sort of wisdom that the fully virtuous person has, right? And that's who we're trying to be. That's the kind of standard for what a right action looks like, according to Hursthouse, right? A fully virtuous person with a fully virtuous character. The sort of wisdom that such a person has is not supposed to be recondite. It does not call for fancy philosophical sophistication, and it does not depend upon, let alone wait upon, the discoveries of academic philosophers. Her idea here, and she footnotes this and says, I'll defend this in another paper sometime later. But her idea here is that, look, to be virtuous, you don't need a PhD. You don't need fancy, sophisticated knowledge, right? To be virtuous, it's a matter of having a certain kind of character. Um, and you don't need to be a specialist in some academic field to have that kind of character, to have a good character. In fact, it might actually be inimical to having such a character. She doesn't say that, but and so the exercise of virtue is not going to require fancy, sophisticated, philosophical knowledge. It's not going to require the kind of knowledge that only a PhD would have, right? Stuff about the metaphysical status of human beings or whatever. Like, nobody even knows what those words mean aside from philosophers. Virtue doesn't require that kind of knowledge. And so, as far if we're viewing ethics through the lens of virtue, personhood of the fetus just doesn't really matter. It's not going to enter our deliberations because it's a matter of recondite, of difficult, hard, unclear, obscure, abstract knowledge or something, right? It's virtue doesn't need that kind of knowledge. Okay, that's why personhood isn't quite relevant, right? Women's rights aren't relevant either. Why? Well, she says, because even if we, let's grant that women have a right to an abortion, even, right? Have that right to privacy and have a right to procure an abortion, have a right to decide what happens into their body. Well, which she points out, in exercising a moral right, I can nonetheless do something cruel or callous or selfish, light-minded, self-righteous, stupid, inconsiderate, disloyal, dishonest. That is, act viciously. Just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean it's morally permissible to do it, because you might be, by exercising that right, you might be acting viciously in some other way, right? You might be acting self-righteously or stupidly or selfishly, even though you have right. So consider, she's kind of drawing Hursthouse, and she cites, she's aware of this. She's relying on or drawing upon Thompson. If you recall Thompson's example of the two brothers with the chocolate, one of them is given all the chocolates, so has a right to all of them, and the other brother isn't given any. The younger brother isn't given any, and the older brother is just sitting there pounding these chocolates or whatever. He's exercising his right. He has a right to all those chocolates, and he's just eating them. He's exercising his right. Nonetheless, he's still acting selfishly. Right? That's Hursthouse point. Right? That's what she's picking up on. In exercising a right, you can still act badly, viciously, immorally. One more example to kind of give you a sense of this point. I have a right, you have a right to speak as you see fit. Freedom of speech. We have a right to the freedom of speech, right? That means I have a right to say horrible, nasty, insulting things. That's my right, right? Yeah, something like that. Nonetheless, in exercising my right, I might be doing something terribly vicious, right? By going around and so I have a right to just go over to my neighbor's house and or whatever, she's out on her lawn, I can just start yelling insults at her, right? Whatever, I have a right to do that, or whatever. I don't know. Actually, I don't have. Well, whatever. It doesn't really matter. I have a right to say hateful things. Let's say, yeah, tell hateful jokes, that kind of thing. Nonetheless, in exercising that right, I'm being mean, I'm being whatever, yeah, something like that. That's the idea. So the mere fact that I have a right to something doesn't mean it would be okay for me to exercise that right and to act in that way. That's Hursthouse point. And it applies, she's going to say, to any right you might have, including the right to have an abortion. So just because a woman has a right to an abortion, that doesn't mean it's okay for her to procure an abortion. It still might be immoral, because in procuring an abortion, she might be acting light-mindedly or inconsiderately or selfishly or callously or something like that. And in that case, the abortion would be morally impermissible. That's Hursthouse view. And so rights don't really matter. What really matter are these virtue and vices. Virtues and vices are the relevant moral considerations, according to Hursthouse. And if you read through her article, there's a whole bunch of virtues, and I've tried to collect them all there. I'm not going to read through them all, right? Those are, and that's not exhaustive. I think she would want to say there's even more besides that. I'm not giving you an exhaustive list. And there's a whole bunch of vices, and there's even more of those that she mentions, right? And so what's important is to act on the virtues and avoid acting on the vices. And in Hursthouse view, certain abortions might be expressions of the virtues, right? It might be the serious minded, self determined, courageous thing to do to procure an abortion, she argues, claims. By contrast, a different woman in a different situation, it might be a cowardly, inconsiderate, foolish, selfish thing to do, getting an abortion, right? Whether or not an abortion is permissible depends upon the particular circumstances and depends upon the kind of reasons for getting it. And so, whether or not the decision to get the abortion is an expression of a virtue or a vice. That's Hursthouse view. And so when we think about the morality of abortion, we don't need to think about personhood of the fetus. We don't need to think about women's rights. Those things are irrelevant. What matters is the kind of character we're exhibiting when we do that. Were we to get an abortion? Are we being serious-minded and responsible, or are we being callous and light-minded? That's what matters, according to Hursthouse. And so what we find with Hursthouse is a kind of proliferation, a further proliferation of the relevant moral considerations. Thompson appeals to rights. Singer appeals to preferences and utility. The Pope appeals to this natural law thing. Hursthouse now is saying, no, none of that. The virtues, the vices.